Hi, my name is Chris, and this is the Lancaster Patriot Podcast. There's a man in Lancaster County named Barry Durmaz. I know Barry personally, and Barry was recently arrested for failing to have a vehicle registration, driver's license, while driving a vehicle on the roadways of Pennsylvania. Now, I want to briefly talk about this case with you, and I want you to keep in mind a few things here. Barry Durmaz did not harm anyone. He did not break any moral law of God. He damaged no property, and he did not violate any contract, and yet he was arrested. He was arrested. Now, how can this be? Well, it can be because we live in a nation where the law of God is spurned and man-made humanistic law is placed as the highest law of the land. Watch this minute clip of Barry right after he was arrested explaining why he is resisting these man-made regulations.
This is an impromptu video update as to how I am overcoming an attack to my self-government by policing agencies. I'm walking home from the county courthouse here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, because I was arrested today. This is Friday, May the 26th. I was arrested because I'm not complying with communistic practices, and this is communism. The sixth plank, you can look it up, the sixth plank of the Communist Manifesto is the centralization of travel and communications in the hands of the state. And that's why the state has become a god. It's become a lawgiver, and I'm not consenting because I serve the one true lawgiver. And let me just...
All right, so that was Barry Durmaz explaining what happened to him. Again, at the end of last month, the end of May 2023, he was arrested for failing to follow all these regulations put forward by the civil government. Now, in fact, he is correct about the sixth plank of the Communist Manifesto, which says centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. That's the sixth plank of the Communist Manifesto. Now, there's so much more we could say, we could watch as well, but I think the average reaction to what Durmaz is doing in refusing to get a driver's license, register his vehicle with the state, I think the average response can be summed up by a comment on Durmaz's YouTube video. And the comment says this, it says, "I'm sorry, Barry, I just can't agree with you. Driving is a privilege legitimately managed by the state, if for no other reason than public safety. If you hurt someone in a car, they have a right to make sure you have insurance to restore the other person as best as can be." Now, let's note a few things about that comment. First, where does this commenter get the idea, biblically or even from the founding of this nation, that driving or travel is a privilege? Freedom to travel is a fundamental right, has a rich history in American thought. In fact, in 1868, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the freedom of movement is a fundamental right, and therefore a state cannot inhibit people from leaving the state by taxing them. So you cannot use monetary penalties in order to regulate travel. But what about traveling within one's states? Surely the principle applies there as well. For instance, Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights reads, "Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state." Traveling is not a privilege. It's not a privilege, and it's not something to be regulated or managed by the state. But the commenter says that it must be managed by the state if for no other reason than public safety. Now here's the rub. Biblical law deals with enforcing justice after the crime has taken place. Humanistic, man-made, tyrannical law attempts to regulate and manage non-evil actions under the guise of, well, we have to do this for public safety. Now listen again to how this man worded it. If you hurt someone in a car, they have a right to make sure you have insurance to restore the other person as best as can be. Now, this is just flat out wrong. If you hurt someone in a car, the victim has the right to receive compensation. The victim has no right to make sure you have insurance prior to you ever hurting someone. You may never injure someone in your vehicle, so there may perhaps never be a victim in your case. And yet, according to this man's logic, the potential victim, the imaginary victim, the non-existent victim in the future has a right to force you to pay money for insurance? Again, this is flat out wrong. It's fallacious arguing. You see, the fundamental difference between man-made and tyrannical law and biblical law is that man-made law seeks to preemptively enforce justice by regulation. True law, biblical law, righteous law only addresses evil acts. If you ever want to know if what you have before you is a righteous law or a tyrannical, unjust law, ask yourself this question. Does this law, this regulation, this mandate, does it punish someone for a non-evil act? If it does, then it is an unjust law, and we have a duty and responsibility in many cases to disobey those laws. Now, I want to give you some examples from the Bible. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8, you have the example of the parapet, the railway on the roof. It says, when you build a new house, then you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring guilt of bloodshed on your household if anyone falls from it. The penalty there attached to the harm done. There was a penalty if someone fell from your roof and was injured because of your negligence. The penalty was not attached to your failure to build the parapet. That's important. Or take the example of a damage done to property in Exodus chapter 22, verse 6. If fire breaks out and catches in thorns, so that stacked grain, standing grain, or the field is consumed, he who kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. Restitution is, in fact, a biblical requirement. Therefore, when we talk about vehicles and travels on the road, private insurance might be a wise option for the individual, but surely it cannot be required preemptively. If Barry Durmaz injures someone with his vehicle, if you or I injure someone with our vehicle, it might be wise for us to have preemptively planned for that and had private insurance, but we cannot force that on other people. Okay, with that in place, though, let's look even deeper at this issue, because some people are going to say, okay, fine, the freedom to travel should be honored and respected, but it's not, and therefore to fight this is foolish. This is not a fight that Barry Durmaz should be fighting. Well, I want to give two examples of that, and before I do that, I want to ask this question. Do you follow every regulation put out by PennDOT or your respective state's Department of Transportation? Do you follow every code or mandate or quote-unquote law from the FDA or USDA as if they have the ability to make law? I doubt you do, because we can't even keep track of all the humanistic man-made law that is coming out every year. But let me give you two examples here of men who decided to pick a fight that maybe you and I wouldn't have. First is well-known Jack Phillips in Colorado of Masterpiece Cake Shop, and he considered creating a pink cake with blue frosting for a gender transition celebration to be a battle worth fighting, and he said no. Now, could he have baked that cake without violating God's law? Perhaps, but certainly not without violating his own conscience. And therefore, he is on solid biblical ground to refuse to do so, because refusing to bake the cake certainly does no violence to God's law. Or consider Gabe, a Moscow, Idaho man who was arrested for refusing to wear a mask during his church's outdoor psalm singing event. Now, he could have put the mask on. He could have stayed home. But he chose to fight that battle, that the freedom to gather publicly without a mask is worth fighting for. Now, I don't envy necessarily Phillips or Wrench for the hardship that they had to go through in fighting these legal battles, but I'm thankful. Yes, they endured personal hardship for it, but their examples now have positively impacted many, many people. It's true that pragmatism and strategy might come into play for some people when making these sorts of decisions. For others, though, the principle of the matter and the strength of conscience are stronger factors. But what all Christians need to think about is the justice of such causes and how we respond to honest Christian men and women who choose to fight a righteous battle, even if you and I would not choose to fight that battle. But there might be battles we are willing to fight, and when we do, I hope we would want our Christian brethren to stand with us. Now, Wrench could have stayed home. Phillips could have acquiesced. He could have made the cake, but he didn't. He didn't do it. And Christians, even if we would not fight that battle, we should stand with them, because we recognize that what is happening to them, what happened to Phillips when he refused to bake that cake, what happened to Wrench when he refused to put on that mask, and what's happening to Barry when he refuses to follow the communistic system of travel in Pennsylvania. What's happened to those men and what's happening to Barry is an injustice, and therefore we should stand beside them. I hope we would agree that supporting Phillips and Wrench is a good thing if we are to learn to do good, seek justice, and correct oppression as the prophet Isaiah instructed us. And I hope we can come to see the same thing when it comes to Barry. And so now back to this case in Lancaster County with Barry Durmaz. Like Phillips in Colorado and Wrench in Idaho, Durmaz has violated no divine law, broken no personal contract, harmed no one, and damaged no property. And yet the state of Pennsylvania is forcing him to pay what can only be deemed as extortion money to make amends for the great crime of driving peacefully on the common roadways of our state. And since he has not paid the bullies, the county apparatus of tyranny arrested him, and from what I understand, gave him another warning, told him, you got to pay this money and let him go. And what Barry told me is that they're not getting their money. I'm not giving them money. I'm not going to submit to this evil of them forcing me to pay for the freedom of travel. Now, why doesn't he just pay the fines? Well, why didn't Philip just bake the cake? Why didn't Wrench just put on the mask? And to give a biblical example, why didn't the Apostle Paul just leave the prison quietly when the civil government instructed him to? In Acts chapter 16, verse 36, we read that the magistrates sent orders to Paul to leave the prison. But Paul thought that this was a battle worth fighting, and so he responded in this way. He said, they have beaten us publicly, uncondemned, men who are Roman citizens, and have thrown us into prison. And do they now throw us out secretly? No, let them come themselves and take us out. Now, Paul could have walked out of that prison cell. It wouldn't have been wrong for him to submit to the civil government there. But he didn't. He took a stand. And he picked a fight, as it were. Now, would we mock a Christian today who acts in a similar manner? Would we call him a crackpot for making such a big deal about the details of his prison release? If there was a man in Lancaster County prison or in your county's prison, and he refused to come out and made a big deal about it, would we call him a crackpot? Would we call him crazy? Or would we recognize that there is a place for fighting these battles? What about the man who recognizes that the tyrannical behemoth of the Department of Transportation is an institution that the law of God provides no justification for, and it now exists primarily to force Pennsylvanians to pay money for the freedom of being allowed to travel? Crackpot? Or perhaps this is a man willing to fight a righteous battle. Again, let's get a few things straight here. The biblical vision for society provides absolutely no basis for the civil government to run around and fine people and arrest people for driving peacefully on the road without a piece of metal on their vehicle or a piece of plastic in their wallet. The civil rulers are only authorized by God to punish evil. Driving on a roadway, harming neither person nor property, is not evil. Second, as is almost always the case, the state and county government care nothing about justice, but only about money. Just as Amos Miller was fined not because the USDA cared about safety, but because they could use the legal loopholes to extract money from the natural farmer, so too do Durmaz's fines have nothing to do with justice. It's not about justice. It's about money and control. And third, if everyone did follow Durmaz's example and peacefully resist the unbiblical, arbitrary, and onerous vehicle code of Pennsylvania, the county government would likely be forced to relent without executing a single arrest warrant. Because true justice and righteous law would never lead to a man going to prison for committing non-evil acts, we should not sit in judgment on Barry Durmaz's conscience, but rather join him in calling on the civil government and the civil magistrates to rule justly, even if we are unwilling to personally go to jail over the matter. Now, it's true that I haven't personally chosen this fight. Perhaps I've chosen others. In this case, I have submitted to the bullies. I let them take my lunch money for the privilege to travel, though it is an injustice. Maybe that's the most pragmatic decision, or maybe I simply need more faith. At this point, I don't know. But I know one thing, and that is that Barry Durmaz is going to go to jail as a matter of principle and conscience. And I have no solid basis to condemn that. He's done no wrong. He's committed no evil. And if there's anyone out there who thinks that there is a basis to arrest Barry Durmaz for what he has done, then I challenge you to come in and publicly defend your view. Because here's a man who has harmed neither person nor property, violated no moral law of God, violated no contract, and yet the state is after him. Why? It's not about justice. It's about money and control.